I'm not here to say that Duke shouldn't be disappointed, that fans of the rivals of Duke shouldn't be taking their trash-talking lap. Do what you do. It's college sports. Do it. But I am here to say, let's not act like this year was some kind of glaring example of how the way Duke has been doing things isn't working. I'd argue the opposite. This year was not a sign that the building process didn't work. It was a sign, actually, that Jon Scheyer building a team does work. The roster was complete, which is why it's crazy to me that suddenly Duke's become this poster child for if you build around freshmen, you can't win. Bmani Jones, I know he has a huge following in the area. I'm a fan. He's been on shows of mine in the past. I disagree with him on this subject. He was he was talking about Duke on his podcast, and this is what he had to say.
Getting those guys does not necessarily mean you're going to win a national championship. That's not necessarily the path. What we've seen happen for teams to win national championships is you need a bunch of grown men that look like they just got off work at UPS. The Duke brand has started to look bad, and so they decided to go with, we're going to get the guys and we're going to put them in the NBA. And truly, that's one way to do it. But what you are going to, by and large, wind up with is a bunch of kids. They might want to rethink the approach, because while they were redoing their approach, North Carolina's approach kind of went in the other direction, and they did not have the top line stars. But in that same time period where Duke has now won a national championship, Carolina won one and got to the national championship game 3 times. If doing what they do results in them losing in a heartbreaking, embarrassing fashion, do it forever.
That's Bmani Jones right there. Could not disagree more. Could not disagree more. The funny part is every single person that watches the college basketball NCAA tournament will acknowledge that the randomness is part of the special, right? The randomness is part of what we love about it. The ball could bounce in this way or that way. And then we draw a line like advancing to the national championship game rather than losing in the Final Four, and act like that's this big barrier that is the measure of everything. Duke made it to 2 Final Fours. UNC made it to 3. And now we're drawing a line in how they build their team is the reason why, rather than acknowledging that that's a wildly small sample size and the ball bounces in funny ways. You're telling me if Caleb Love, a sophomore at the time, not a grizzled 4-year UPS, whatever Bmani said, comes up a little short on a 3, and Cooper Flagg makes a shot that he probably makes like 70% of the time, if those two things just go the opposite way, that's because Duke doesn't have freshmen? That's once you put together a really good roster, then you kind of just have to keep rolling the dice until you win, right? It's nobody is going to win every time they get there. There's no Michael Jordans in college basketball where you go 6-0 in the finals. Like, you're not going to do that because you don't play series. Now, I understand if you watched the national championship game, you saw 2 teams, Florida and Houston, where none of the starters were freshmen. And then you saw Duke lose in heartbreaking fashion, and you wanted to go, all right, it's because these teams have all the veterans and Duke doesn't, and that's how you get there. Well, guess what? Houston made all the same mistakes that Duke made in the second half, and they had guys 4- and 5-year starters. Auburn didn't make it out of the final. They made it just as far as Duke. Auburn's the oldest team I can remember in college basketball.
Like older than some NBA rosters, it feels like.
By more, like starting lineup-wise, by more than a year on average, they're older than some starting lineups in the NBA. Duke in the last 10 years hasn't made it to a national championship game. I get it. But they have made the Final Four with 2 different coaches in the last 10 years. There is a gap when you change coaches. And I'm saying actually different coaches, not a new coach taking an old coach's players to the Final Four. Sorry, UNC, but that's kind of what happened. Hubert Davis got a Final Four under his belt, but let's not act like he recruited all of those guys as the head coach. since his team has kind of taken over recently, hasn't been the same amount of success. Listen, I'm not here to say the way UNC is building is wrong. I'm not here to say the way Duke is building is wrong. I am saying that if you think the way Duke hasn't made it to a national championship game in the last 10 years is a sign that you can't build around freshmen after watching this season's roster for Duke, I can't help you. And you just have to acknowledge that in any given year, I'm not saying like it's so random that anybody can win. There's probably 10 to 12 teams that have varying degrees of they might win it all going into the NCAA tournament. And not to mention, right, UNC builds with veterans. What else has UNC had in their 3 runs to the national championship game? 2 of the most heartbreaking losses in NCAA tournament finals history. The Chris Jenkins shot from Villanova and the biggest collapse as far as how big your lead was to lose in tournament final history versus Kansas.
16 points in that game.
And they had veterans.
Yeah.
And they had veterans.
You know, point to Duke's 14-point collapse in the Final Four game. Carolina just a few years ago, 16-point collapse in the second half in a national championship game.
And I'm not, Dennis, I don't know your motivation, but I assume not. I'm not saying that to go like, you did it too. I'm saying it to say a veteran team can collapse and a young team can collapse.
Yeah.
And I don't look at either one and say the reason why is because those guys were old or because those guys were young or because those guys weren't NBA players or because those guys were NBA players. I'm not saying that. I'm saying in college basketball, in general, things happen. And if you look at like those specifics and then make big overarching changes, you're missing the point. If Duke came back next year and they didn't play the Boozer twins who are going to be incoming freshmen because they went out and bought a bunch of 5th year, 4th year seniors in the transfer portal because that worked for Florida and Auburn and Houston, that'd be ridiculous. That'd be ridiculous. There's more than one way to win a national championship. And all you can do is keep getting there and keep getting there and keep getting there and keep getting there, and eventually they'll fall your way. I mean, to use Duke history, Coach K made it to a bunch of Final Fours before he finally won a national championship. And you didn't even really have the choice whether you were building around freshmen or vets there. You just got guys on campus and let them age as they do.
And the thing to keep in mind as well is that Bmani had mentioned 10 years ago the turn of Coach K going to one-and-dones. And really even before that, it was around that time was when Kyrie Irving was a one-and-done player, and even long before that. But we saw that turn back then. But now, like the last 4 years of college basketball is different than it was 10 years ago now with transfer portal and things along those lines. So guess what? You might bring on a 4th-year senior player, but he's still a first year in your program. I understand they have 3 years maybe somewhere else, but they still got to learn what it's like to play in your league and on your team and your culture. It's different. It's just a different era now than it was 5 years ago. Just simply is. So to compare 5-10 years ago to now, to me, that it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't.
The other point, there's 2 more points here I want to make, and then we'll move on, I promise. It's not really 10 years because one tournament was canceled. Duke wasn't playing their best that year, but you never know. And 2, they made one national final in the 10 years after Kyrie, right? They made the switch to the one-and-dones, and they made one. They made one in the previous 9 years before Kyrie when they were building with veterans. So it's really hard to make a national final. Really hard. If you tear up the blueprint and change it, no intended on the blueprint. Now, if you tear up the schematics and rebuild square one every time you go a handful of years without making a national final, you're gonna throw out some really, really good plans. If Duke is exactly as good as they were this year, the next 5 years, they'll win a national championship. Maybe more. And UNC, the same thing. If you put together a team that's as good as the teams that won a national championship for you in the past, and you do that for 5 years, you'll win a national championship, maybe more.